They don't. In high-conflict legal and financial situations, there is a moment, a specific moment, where control quietly shifts. No announcement, no warning, no visible event that marks the transition. And most people, most intelligent, capable, experienced people, do not recognize it when it happens. They continue acting as if they are still in control, making decisions, sending communications, taking action, planning their next move. But structurally, beneath the activity, beneath the visible conflict, something has already changed. The architecture of the dispute has shifted, and by the time they realize it, the system is no longer responding to them. This video is about that moment, what precedes it, what causes it, and why, in the vast majority of cases, it arrives completely undetected. This channel, The Strategic Brief, was built on a single premise: that disputes in their most consequential form are not primarily emotional events, they are structural ones, and the individuals who navigate them most effectively are not necessarily the ones who fight hardest. They are the ones who understand the structure beneath the fight. Everything examined on this channel comes back to three variables: power, who holds it, how it is exercised, and how it moves; procedure, the formal and informal mechanisms that govern how decisions get made; control, where it sits at any given moment, and when it begins to shift. Because those who understand these dynamics do not simply react to events, they read them, they anticipate them, and they position accordingly. One of the most persistent and consequential misunderstandings in high-conflict environments is this: people confuse activity with control. They are not the same thing. They rarely even correlate. In the early and middle phases of a dispute, most participants are genuinely active. They are present. They are engaged. They are making decisions, responding to developments, managing communications, directing strategy. And because the activity is real, because the emails are going out and responses are coming back and processes are visibly moving, the sense of control feels equally real. It feels like evidence. I am acting, therefore I am in control. But control is not defined by activity. It is not defined by presence or effort or volume of communication. Control, in the structural sense that actually determines outcomes, is defined by one thing only: who determines the decisions that matter, not who responds, not who participates, not who is the most active or the most vocal or the most persistent, but who, at the level of decisions that actually shape the trajectory of the dispute, holds the authority to determine what happens next. And here is the critical point. In most high-conflict situations, that authority begins to shift well before anyone explicitly acknowledges it. The system does not send a formal notification. There is no threshold that is visibly crossed. There is no moment where the individual is told, from this point forward, your control is diminished. Instead, the shift happens procedurally, gradually, beneath the surface of visible activity, and the activity continues. Emails are still sent, responses still arrive, the dispute still moves, but the individual's no longer driving it. They are, in the most important structural sense, responding to a system that is now operating according to its own logic, not theirs. Before the moment of transition, there are signals. Almost always. They are rarely dramatic. They do not announce themselves. But for those trained to observe them, they are consistent enough to constitute a pattern. The first signal is the formalization of communication. Before a control shift, communication in a dispute tends to have a degree of directness to it. Parties communicate with each other. Positions are exchanged. Negotiations occur in a relatively fluid environment. When formalization begins, when responses become more structured, more hedged, more carefully worded, this is often an early indicator that the environment is changing. Direct communication begins to route through intermediaries. Statements become more guarded. What was once a conversation becomes a correspondence. The second signal is the introduction of process. Decisions that were once made fluidly begin to require documentation. Requests that were previously answered directly now require review. Timelines that were once negotiable become fixed and non-negotiable. Process is the architecture of institutional authority. When it appears, when the informal becomes formal, when the flexible becomes procedural, it indicates that decision-making is moving into a structure that operates independently of personal relationships and personal urgency. The third signal is the arrival of third parties. In many high-conflict disputes, the introduction of external parties, formal or informal, appointed or voluntary, signals that the bilateral dynamic of the dispute is ending. A new participant is entering the environment. And with that new participant comes a new decision-making framework, one that was not part of the original dispute structure, one that operates according to objectives that may bear limited resemblance to the objectives of either original party. The fourth signal is informational filtering. Before a control shift, information tends to move with relative freedom. Parties know what is happening. They receive updates. They are consulted. When information begins to be filtered, when updates slow, when responses become vague, when certain questions go unanswered, this is often a signal that the flow of information is being managed by a system that the individual no longer controls. None of these signals, taken individually, constitutes proof of anything. They are soft indicators, they can be explained away, and they routinely are, which is precisely why they are consistently missed. The question worth examining is not simply what the signals are. It is why, given that these signals are often visible in retrospect, they are so consistently missed in real time. The answer is not primarily about intelligence or sophistication. Some of the most experienced individuals in complex legal and financial environments have missed exactly these signals at critical moments. The reasons are psychological, and they are worth understanding because awareness of them is the beginning of being able to correct for them. The first reason is ego, not ego in a pejorative sense, but ego in the structural sense, the natural human tendency to place oneself at the center of a situation. In a dispute that has consumed months or years of attention, energy, and resources, it is psychologically very difficult to accept that the situation may have evolved beyond your personal authority. The mind resists that reframing. It interprets continued activity as continued control. It interprets responses as engagement. It interprets participation as centrality. And so, the signals that indicate diminishing authority are reframed as temporary, as procedural, as manageable, rather than recognized for what they are. The second reason is urgency. High conflict disputes create a state of sustained urgency. There is always an immediate problem, always a deadline, always a response required, and that sustained urgency creates a cognitive tunnel. Attention is directed entirely at the immediate, the next communication, the next filing, the next development. The wider structural picture recedes. The signals that indicate a shift in the underlying architecture are peripheral. They do not feel urgent, so they do not receive attention. But structural shifts do not care about urgency. They occur whether or not the individual is paying attention to them. The third reason is assumption. Once people have operated in a situation for a period of time, they develop assumptions about how that situation works, who the decision makers are, how communication flows, how decisions get made, what the rules of engagement look like. These assumptions are often accurate when they are formed. But as situations evolve, as bankruptcy occurs, as third parties are introduced, as legal structures shift, the assumptions may no longer reflect reality. The situation has changed, but the assumptions have not been updated, and so the individual continues operating according to a model of the situation that is no longer accurate. These three drivers, ego, urgency, and assumption, do not operate independently. They reinforce each other. Together, they create a state where the individual is genuinely convinced they understand and are managing their situation, while structurally, the situation has moved beyond their management entirely. And this is what creates the conditions for the moment we are building toward. A moment that is not dramatic, not sudden, not even immediately visible, but one that, once it occurs, changes the structure of the dispute permanently. The moment of control transition does not emerge from nowhere. It is preceded by a period of gradual reallocation, a transition phase where the architecture of the dispute is shifting, but the individual has not yet registered the full extent of the change. During this period, the individual typically retains some genuine influence. They are still consulted on certain matters. Their input still enters the process. Their communications still receive responses. But the nature of that influence is changing. What was once direct is becoming indirect. What was once immediate is becoming mediated. What was once a conversation with decision makers is becoming a submission to a process. This is the most dangerous phase, because it provides just enough of the appearance of control to prevent the individual from recognizing what is actually happening. They receive a response to a communication and interpret it as engagement. They are consulted on a decision and interpret it as authority. They take an action and interpret the absence of immediate pushback as success. But during this phase, the gap is widening. The gap between perceived control, the subjective sense of being in the driver's seat, and actual control, the structural reality of who is determining outcomes. And as that gap widens, the consequences of misalignment multiply. Actions taken in the belief that they are controlling the situation are, in reality, operating outside the system's core decision-making architecture. They produce friction rather than results. They consume resources without altering outcomes. They escalate without resolving. This is the build-up, the structural conditions that precede the moment. And it is in this phase, not after the moment has occurred, that effective recalibration is still fully possible. The moment you lose control is not when something is taken from you. It is not a confrontation. It is not a court order. It is not a dramatic intervention by an external authority. It is the moment when decision-making authority, the structural power to determine what happens next, is reassigned. To a process, to an institution, to a party whose mandate is entirely different from yours. And the mechanism by which that reassignment occurs is almost always the same. It happens through procedure, through the formal operation of a legal or institutional framework that was always present in the background, but now moves to the foreground. At that moment, and from that moment forward, the individual's relationship to the dispute changes fundamentally. They can still act, but they no longer decide. They can still respond, but they no longer direct outcomes. They can still participate. They can still communicate. They can still assert their position, but they are no longer central to the system that is determining how this ends. And the most consequential aspect of this moment, the element that makes it so consistently missed and so routinely underestimated, is this. The system does not inform you when it happens. There is no formal notification, no letter that arrives, no email that flags the transition, no hearing where the change is announced. The system simply continues operating, and the individual continues operating. And the gap between those two trajectories, between what the individual believes they are determining and what the system is actually determining, quietly and persistently widens. Once the reassignment has occurred, a predictable pattern of behavior tends to emerge, and it is worth examining closely, because it represents the most common and most costly response to a loss of structural control. The first response is escalation. The individual notices that the system is not responding in the way it used to. Decisions are not going their way. Communications are not producing the results they previously did. The sense of agency that previously accompanied action has diminished. And the natural, instinctive response to that diminished agency is to increase the intensity of the effort, to push harder, to communicate more, to take more action, to be more assertive, more forceful, more present. But escalation within a system that has already reassigned decision-making authority does not restore that authority. It amplifies noise without changing the structure. It consumes resources, financial, emotional, relational, without altering outcomes. And it often produces a secondary consequence that further compounds the problem. The second response is reactive decision-making. Without structural authority, without the ability to set the agenda and direct the process, individuals often fall into a mode of responding to events rather than shaping them. Every development triggers a reaction. Every action by a counterparty produces an immediate response. The individual is operating entirely on the surface of the dispute, reacting to what is visible rather than engaging with what is structural. And reactive decision-making in an environment you no longer control is among the least effective modes of operating, because the system is not responding to your reactions. It is advancing according to its own logic. Your reactions are, at best, noted. At worst, they complicate your position further. The third response, and perhaps the most psychologically difficult to examine, is denial. Not the dramatic, irrational denial of someone who is completely disengaged from reality, but the quiet, functional denial of someone who knows something, has changed, but cannot yet fully integrate what that means. They continue describing the situation in terms that reflect the earlier dynamic. They continue referencing relationships and understandings that no longer carry the weight they once did. They continue planning as if the options available to them in the pre-transition phase remain available now. This form of denial is not weakness. It is a very human response to a structural change that is genuinely disorienting. But it has a significant strategic cost, because every week spent operating in the pre-transition mode is a week in which the window for effective recalibration is narrowing. Consider a hypothetical situation, constructed from the consistent patterns that appear across high-conflict disputes involving this kind of structural shift. A business owner, experienced, capable, accustomed to operating in complex environments, finds themselves involved in a multidimensional dispute. There are contractual disputes with former partners, financial obligations that have accumulated over an extended period, legal proceedings that are active on multiple fronts simultaneously, and the pressure that accumulates when all of these forces operate at once. In the early phase, the owner is genuinely in control. They direct their legal strategy. They manage relationships with creditors. They make decisions about what to contest and what to concede. They control the pace and the direction of negotiations. This is real authority, exercised with genuine effect. Over time, external pressures intensify. Financial positions become more constrained. Legal proceedings become more complex. Third parties, lenders, advisors, institutional creditors become more formally involved. The owner continues operating at the same intensity, perhaps greater intensity, because the stakes are higher and the urgency is more acute. But beneath that intensity, the signals are appearing. Communications are becoming more formal. Decisions are being routed through additional layers. Responses are slower. The direct relationships that previously allowed for fluid decision-making are beginning to be mediated by process. The owner does not adjust. The urgency of the visible conflict prevents the structural signals from registering as significant. There is always a more immediate problem demanding attention. Then the transition point arrives. A formal legal or financial mechanism is triggered, the exact nature of which varies by circumstance. A party enters that now holds structural authority over significant aspects of the dispute. And from that moment, the owner's relationship to the situation fundamentally changes. But the owner does not immediately recognize this. They continue communicating directly with counterparties. They continue attempting to negotiate bilateral outcomes that are no longer bilaterally available. They continue directing strategy as if the authority to do so still sits with them. Weeks pass. The disconnect between their model of the situation and the structural reality of the situation continues to widen. Decisions are made, significant decisions, that the owner had no meaningful input into. Outcomes begin to emerge that they had not anticipated. And at a certain point, different for every individual, but always the same in its essential character, the realization arrives. The situation is not what they thought it was. The control they believed they held had already shifted, and the options that were available to them in the weeks before that shift, options that could have been exercised, positions that could have been established, relationships that could have been leveraged, those options had quietly closed, not because they were taken, but because the window had passed, and no one had signaled its closure. The conclusion of this analysis is not that control loss is inevitable. In some circumstances, it is. In others, it can be significantly delayed or modified with the right interventions at the right time. But the primary conclusion is more fundamental than either of those things. The objective is awareness. Specifically, the ability to recognize where control actually resides at any given moment, not where it appears to reside, and not where you wish it resided, but where it structurally sits. Because everything that follows from that recognition depends on the recognition being accurate. If you understand that authority has begun to transition, early, while the transition is still in its formative phase, the options available to you are substantially wider than if you recognize it only after the transition is complete. The earlier the signal is read, the earlier the recalibration can begin. And recalibration, the deliberate shift from a mode of operating that no longer fits the structural reality to one that does, is not concession. It is not defeat. It is the most sophisticated response available to someone who understands what has changed and is willing to adjust accordingly. Because the individuals who navigate these environments most effectively are not the ones who fight the structural shift. They are the ones who see it coming and position themselves within it before it fully arrives. Not all control can be preserved, but clarity about where control resides and how it moves is itself a form of control. The kind that no procedural event can fully reassign. The structural dynamics examined in this video are not widely discussed. They do not appear in general commentary on legal or financial disputes. They are not taught as part of standard professional education. But they are, in the experience of those who operate in high-conflict environments, among the most consequential variables in determining how disputes actually resolve. This channel exists for individuals who want to understand disputes at that level, not the surface level of positions and arguments and outcomes, but the structural level, where power sits, how procedure operates, and when control begins to move. If that perspective is useful to you, consider subscribing. Every episode examines a different dimension of this structural landscape, with the same analytical framework and the same commitment to clarity over noise. If you're currently navigating a high-conflict legal or financial situation, and you would like strategic perspective on the structural dynamics of your position, you may make contact at thestrategicbrief71c@gmail.com. Any discussion provided through that channel is general strategic commentary only. It does not constitute legal advice. If your situation requires legal advice, you should engage a qualified legal practitioner who is familiar with the specific laws and procedures of your jurisdiction. Most people focus on the visible conflict, the arguments, the positions, the outcomes. Very few focus on control, where it sits, how it moves, when it shifts. But in high conflict environments, that is often the only variable that truly matters.